Hello and welcome. I'm so excited that you're all here with us today for our Tributary Talk here at Headwaters Foundation for Justice. My name is Maria de la Cruz, and I'm the president here at Headwaters, and we are just thrilled to be in community with you and appreciate that we're able to hold this space virtually to accommodate our speakers as well as our audience members who are actually joining us from across the country. I'm excited to share that we have had over 200 registrations, nearly 230 people signed up for this time with us today. So we know that this is a topic of extreme interest for our Headwaters community and beyond. Our topic has also attracted many professional fundraisers. And so we're excited to have you here with us today as we talk about donors resourcing movements. And I'm guessing you're here to learn what's our secret sauce. What's the magic that helps us to organize donors in the ways that we do. So we'll be having some Q&A session later and hope to be able to answer some of the questions you have. So the way the next 90 minutes is going to work is that I'll introduce our speakers and we're going to jump right into the mix. So we intend to save 20 to 30 minutes towards the end of our conversation for robust Q&A, and I invite you to add questions to the Q&A portion of your Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can after we move through our agenda today. So again, my name is Maria de la Cruz, and today I'm going to be playing three roles in this event. One is I'm here to be a facilitator, so I'm here to help keep the conversation moving. I think you're going to be really excited to hear from my friends that I'm talking with today. I'm also here as a participant in the conversation, adding my own experiences and thoughts around donor organizing for movements. And then finally, I'll also be moderating the question and answer portion of our time today. This is our second Tributary Talk, and this is a new series that we are trying, especially during COVID, to keep us connected and aligned throughout our Headwaters community. This past fall, we hosted a conversation about radical rest, and now we're switching gears to talk about the donor's role in resourcing movements. As many of you know, Headwaters prides itself on being in relationship with our donors and grantee partners in true and authentic ways. You may have read some of my tributary posts over the last year or so, and in those posts, I talk a lot about themes that are related to who I am and what inspires me. They're really personal. I also talk about the challenges that are keeping me up at night, as well as how our movements for collective liberation fuel me to show up for and with our communities at Headwaters every single day. Tributary Talks moves my inner thoughts to a space of conversation with other people. These are my friends. These are folks that I work with here at Headwaters, and I'm so excited that they can sit and grapple with these questions with me that I carry with me as I work here at Headwaters on a daily basis. For this Tributary Talk, we have some sponsors that I want to make sure that I call out and say thanks to. First is Claim Our Space. Claim Our Space manages virtual and in-person events and makes all the things shine. They actually help to manage this project today. And so you're getting to see right now the results of their labor. So thank you, Claim Our Space. We are also being sponsored by Moon Palace Books, my favorite bookstore based in South Minneapolis. They are a locally owned radical independent bookstore, and they are just down the street, essentially, from the Headwaters offices in South Minneapolis. We are also being sponsored by our friends at Propel for Nonprofits. They offer tools for everything you need to know about supporting and becoming a successful nonprofit. And I'll just say I've had the pleasure to be mentored by Kate Barr, who leads the organization. So thanks for your support. And then finally, we're being sponsored by Roya LLC. Roya provides relational financial management, planning, and investment services. Thankfully, they also support several Headwaters donors because we are so values aligned. So thanks again, Roya, for your support as well. So let's jump into it. I want to introduce our speakers that are joining me today. Elizabeth Scott grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, but has called Minnesota home for almost 25 years. At the age of 23, she inherited a significant amount of wealth and began the internal work of really figuring out how to align her dollars with her core values. For the past 10 years, she has redistributed over $5 million, as well as helped to organize and support family members and other folks with high net worth to make giving plans and redistribute funds. She graduated from St. Olaf College and received a master's degree in social work and a master's in public health. She's a really smart cookie. Elizabeth lives in South Minneapolis with her spouse and teen daughter, whom she homeschools, and she enjoys spending time traveling the world with her family and volunteering in hospice care. So welcome and thanks, Elizabeth, for joining us.
Hey,
yeah, for sure. Next up is my friend, Hali Lee. Hali is delighted to have been a co-builder of several philanthropic infrastructure pieces. She is co-founding partner of Radiant Strategies. She co-founded the Donors of Color Network, was on the design team for Philanthropy Together, and is the founder of the Asian Women Giving Circle. Hali was born in Seoul, Korea, and grew up in Kansas City. She graduated from Princeton, studied Buddhism at Mahidol University in Bangkok, and received a master's in social work from New York University. Hali lives in Brooklyn with her family, but is joining us from Washington, D.C. She fit us into her very busy schedule. So welcome, Hali. Glad to have you. And then finally, we have Nneka Onwuzurike. Nneka is a policy advisor, donor organizer, and writer. Clearly a busy human being. She is the founder and CEO of 929 Consulting Group, a racial justice and economic development consulting firm that works with institutions and communities to democratize capital and power. She's also the lead organizer, donor organizer for the Fields at Root Springs, a cooperative nonprofit partnership stewarding healing and retreat space for BIPOC artists, organizers, and healers here in the state of Minnesota. She also consults for the City of Chicago's Mayor's Office of Equity and Racial Justice, where she leads their community wealth building initiative that focuses on local democratic shared ownership and control of assets. Nneka received her bachelor's of science in business administration at Washington University and is on a leave of absence from a joint master's program at Harvard. Nneka lives in Chicago, but still calls Detroit, Michigan home, and of course has been a part of Headwaters giving projects in the past as well. So thanks so much for joining us today, all of you. All right.
Thanks for having us, Maria.
Absolutely. So before we jump into our first question, I want to just lay some context about why we chose this topic and how we're going to be talking about this today. So the donor's role in resourcing movements is a really natural topic for us here at Headwaters. Donor organizing is at the core of our fundraising, and it's the way that we do our work and have been really building our work for the last about 7 to 10 years here. We specialize in organizing donors differently from sort of traditional fundraising outfits in other nonprofits. I have a background that really is more traditional, and so Headwaters was a space where I felt like I got to build for the first time in a new and different and more inspiring way with donors. We believe that many of our audience members were attracted to this event because you want to know our insider secrets, right? To motivating donors to be bold, how to give without restrictions or prioritizing tax credit, and how to be more sustaining with their gifts. And we'll get to some of those strategies during this conversation. But our process, our approach here at Headwaters really isn't so secret. We're part of our own movement to do fundraising differently, more purposefully. We operate on a philosophy of being in relationship with donors. We believe, like Edgar Villanueva shares in his Decolonizing Wealth book, that money can be used as medicine to heal, but that takes a lot of intention. We're seeing a major culture shift through the pandemic and racial justice uprising that began in our own backyard here after the murder of George Floyd. Of course, with the war in Ukraine and continued conflicts in the other parts of the world, we'll continue to see this as well. So many issues that have been dismissed by mainstream media, continue to be issues that we focus on here. It's easy to feel really overwhelmed and heartbroken by the state of the world, but supporting movement organizers that are changing unjust systems is the key to our collective future, and that's really the message that we take to our donors. donors as members of movements is a really specific role to play. These aren't sort of other people's movements, right? As donors and donor organizers, these are our movements too, and we have a lot to contribute. So let's start with the personal, and then we're going to move into the professional. So first, we're all just going to talk a little bit about what our stories are, what led us to play a role in philanthropy, whether it's as a donor organizer, or both. So I would love to just hand this over to Elizabeth to get us started. And then again, this is really meant to be a conversation. So you might all hear us kind of interrupting and asking each other questions as we continue our conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, please do. Thanks, Maria. So my name's Elizabeth Scott. I would say the biggest thing to know about me and how I came to philanthropy is that when I was 23 years old, I inherited significant wealth. Prior to that, I had a sense that my family held wealth and had been earning that wealth, but I didn't understand the magnitude of it. And I definitely didn't understand that or had any knowledge that I would inherit that at a young age. I was raised in an upper middle class family kind of lifestyle in Omaha, Nebraska. Found out about that money at 23, and there were no restrictions on that wealth when it was just completely mine. I had access to all of it at 23. My parents, in telling me that, really expressed their concern. They didn't, that hadn't been their plan, but this money was legally mine. They weren't going to try to influence me in any way or control me, but they really hoped and made clear that their expectation was that I would give the majority of that money away over my lifetime. And also part of my story is that my family doesn't come from what you might think of as old money. They became really ultra wealthy with my grandparents and parents during the 80s and 90s during the stock market boom. So, yeah.
Great.
I will pass.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hali?
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you, Maria and team, and Mary and Nolan's team. Thanks for being so organized and welcoming to your space. I think I saw on the list that I have some friends out there in the internet world. So I just wanted to shout out to Latarik, my dear philanthropy sister and co-builder of Radiant with me, and Afi and Makia and Rajiv. I think you're out there too. So I'm just saying hi. I do that because this is work that we have. All the problems that we're facing are too big for any one person to solve, no matter how wealthy. And I think we just got to join hands across as many silos as we can in order to work well and deeply and relationally. And it's also more fun if you can find brothers and sisters and cousins to do this work along with you. So I think that a lot of us on this conversation didn't really intend to get into philanthropy. My family immigrated from Korea when I was under 1 year old, and my parents were born under sort of a brutal colonial empire building regime, and many Korean people of generation lost everything in two wars, World War II and the Korean War. So they made their way here, and there were restrictive laws that prevented Asian American people from coming to America until 1965, and there was a big wave of Koreans who came soon after that. And my parents came in the late 60s. My start in philanthropy was really on the other side of the philanthropic table in a way. I was the ED, a youth services provider in the Korean American community in Queens, in New York, which is where I live. And it was being an ED is the hardest job in the whole world, in my opinion. And raising money from, at that time, the sort of pillars in society, it was hard because domestic violence was something that many folks thought that we really shouldn't even be talking about. Around the same time, I was invited to join the board of the New York Women's Foundation. And it was there that I witnessed firsthand, mouth agape, the power of those kitchen tables of women York, mostly white women, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars around a meal for women and girls programs around New York City. I just couldn't believe it. And it was my awakening in a way. That was kind of my philanthropy college, where were one of my first funders as a grant seeker. And then the third thread that I shared is that I was part of a GET. And all of us, I mean, Latark and I talk about this all the time, all of us come from cultures of giving. We really do. And it's, people have been coming together to pool their money and give it away together since humans have been living in towns together, in communities together. And in Korea, that cultural practice is called a ge. And I've been part of several ge's with my girlfriends, often kind of frivolous, but fun, where we pull our money and take turns taking it home. But in this case, I decided to turn my ge into a philanthropic vehicle called the Asian Women Giving Circle. So around that same time as the New York Women's Foundation and I was an ED, I was doing this thing with my girlfriends to pull money and give it away and make decisions together about where to give it away. And it's been really fun to see the proliferation of all those giving models out there now. Nneka, pass it to you.
Well, no, I appreciate what you're saying too, Hali, around how all of us come from cultures of giving, right? And so like being able to just acknowledge that so much of this is just a part of who we are as people. But there is an industry around philanthropy. And also to your point, I think, I never thought I would be in philanthropy. I didn't know what philanthropy was for a very long time. And I think for me, I got to this place by just continuing to ask questions. And at each point in my life, it kept getting me closer and closer to this point where I was like, oh, I think a core problem is just we need to think about how do we democratize capital and democratize power. And so I like to start my story, at least how I got into donor organizing in 2014, when I first moved to Minneapolis. And 2014 for me was a year of a lot of grief. So my family, we had lost someone in our family. And so about a month before I moved there, I was kind of already in this period of grief. I moved there, and about a month or two afterwards, Mike Brown had been murdered, and I had just moved from St. Louis. And so I was seeing my community back in St. Louis being politicized and organizing. And, at the time I was working in corporate America. I was working at General Mills actually, and was just really reflecting on how, so many Black people around me, both closely in my family and kind of broadly, are like enraged and grieving. And, every day I was talking about like Honey Nut Cheerios and Betty Crocker frosting, and very much knew like there was not an alignment for me in terms of what I wanted to be doing every day in the communities that I wanted to be serving. And so it was actually the arts in many ways that saved me and like reminded me of my purpose and my story. And I'd wanted to be a writer growing up. And, traditional Nigerian immigrant parents gave me the options of, doctor, lawyer, engineer, and somehow ended up in corporate America. But I always really wanted to be a writer and was passionate about the arts. And so in Minneapolis, and I'm so grateful for becoming a writer and an organizer in Minneapolis and the community and the resources that are there to support artists. But I started to write and was a part of various fellowship programs and communities and cohorts of artists creating work. And that's really where I found my community and my political home through the artist community in Minneapolis. I think particularly the Black and BIPOC artist community there. And I think one of the gifts of that and one of the gifts in Minneapolis is that the artist community and the organizing community are overlapped so much. And so for me, I was doing a lot of work and cultural organizing and teaching in community around my identity as a Black person, as a Nigerian woman, as a daughter of immigrants, and also felt like a calling to be more engaged in movement work, seeing my other friends, my other artist friends being involved in organizing work in other ways. I felt really pulled towards that work, but also really hesitant in a lot of ways. And it took me a while to realize that, it was because I felt like I didn't quite belong in those spaces that, and I definitely did not have the language for it at the time. Actually, one of my friends who just texted me that they're in the audience, Elizabeth Tannen, we were sitting outside a poetry reading, waiting for a poetry reading to start. I think we were like at Ola Repa, like getting drinks and just catching up. And I was kind of like processing this with her a little bit of like, you know, she was inviting me more into organizing spaces, and I kept being like, I want to be involved, but I just don't think I'm meant to do that work, or that I'm right there. And through a conversation with her, an invitation from her, coming to the point of realizing that it was my class privilege, really, that made me feel like, you know, yes, I've experienced racism in this country, but also my class has cushioned me from some of the ways in which racism shows up, some of the most brutal and violent ways in which racism shows up. And so for me, I was kind of questioning, like, is it right for me to be in movement organizing work if I haven't experienced those issues to the same degree? And through conversation with her, she starts like naming, like, have you heard of Headwaters? Have you heard of Giving Project? Have you heard of Resource Generation? And I'm like, I don't know anything that you're saying to me right now. But basically getting to this point of like, oh, there are spaces. Well, one, there's a role for everyone in movement work. And a role that I could take on is thinking about how can I actually leverage, rather than being ashamed of or embarrassed of my class privilege, but how can I like take responsibility and start thinking about how do I move RESEs to movement organizations. And so that conversation at Ola Repa, I think, really put me on a new trajectory where I started to ask more questions, get involved with Giving Project and other spaces to really think about, oh, there's a role for me, and there's work that I'm really interested in and passionate about. And that's resource mobilization. So yeah, that's my story.
Awesome. I mean, I think so many parts of your stories I can really relate to and connect with. I had no idea this thing, philanthropy, and I didn't really know what it was until I started working in the nonprofit sector. But looking back on my life, right, I always identify as a poor kid. That's how I grew up. I grew up in poverty, you know, and thinking about in my communities what philanthropy really looked like was a couch to crash on. It looked like somebody gifting my family with a Christmas tree one year because my mom couldn't afford it. Different ways of coming to that realization of like, yeah, our communities actually know exactly what philanthropy is. And sometimes it looks a little bit different than, you know, a check or a stock transfer, those kinds of things. But for me, when I really started to realize that working with donors was a place where I felt like I really wanted to make a difference, frankly, it came from a curiosity of like, how do donors think about their money? And in particular, how do wealthy people, and wealthy white people in particular, do their giving, think about giving, thinking about what their priorities are, et cetera. And so I always say, like, I've made part of my, you know, my life's work has really been to put myself in a relationship with people who are very, very different than I am, different life experiences, different access to resources, et cetera. And then coming here to Headwaters, you know, over 8 years ago, and working on things like the Giving Project, and really the realization that grassroots giving, that donors who give, you know, gifts under $1,000 are really making a huge difference. They actually make up the majority of the donors here at Headwaters. And so now having that perspective of like, what does it mean for me to work with somebody like Elizabeth, who is a high net worth individual, but also to be really working within grassroots donor communities, people who look just like me, who come from the same places that I do and have, you know, similar class experiences. And may, for the first time, like myself, right, I'm a class straddler. I'm solidly middle class now. And what does it mean for me to do my own philanthropy and connecting with people in that way? I think one of the things that I see as a really big theme in this is just like how important our stories are to the ways in which we think about our roles in this work. And so much of that is, you know, every single one of us talked about our families, but also just, you know, thinking about the sort of different experiences we've had. So when I really want to kind of dig into here is, you know, as you're sort of like thinking about your work with donors, your work within your family, Elizabeth, I think about the organizing you do in your family system. You know, how do you start to make sense of wealth in America and really think about how we communicate about, you know, what this looks like, and this idea of donor organizing, right? It's a really different way of sort of looking at the flow of resources to nonprofits. So, for myself, I'll just say, I really see giving as a form of activism. It's really something that feels really important that we are values aligned around it. And it's one of the ways that, oftentimes when I'm talking with a donor, I'm actually bringing my really personal story. I think oftentimes in traditional fundraising, that's not necessarily encouraged for a fundraising staff to really bring that personal element to the conversation. But for me, it is that personal story that I think helps donors to really connect with the purpose of why I'm asking them to give in the first place.
I just think about what you're talking about, Maria, and how it's about vulnerability, right? A vulnerability on both sides, and I've done that with you. You've done that with me, and it's hard. I mean, I don't know what else other to say about it, but I feel like as we do it, it gets easier. I think about that, when I think about what got me to the place that I am in now, I mean, of course, it's been many steps, but there's been some key things. So I think first of all is that is the education piece. So understanding, you shared about you're growing up poor. I was raised for all intents and purposes upper middle class. And so I knew what that was like. And I really didn't know about what experiences were like for folks who grew up poor. I mean, we're all kind of in that little silo. And it's only been through meeting people and talking to people from various class backgrounds and breaking down some of that, because that doesn't really happen in our society. Mixing different classes, but in a lot of spaces doesn't happen. And also just talking about class, definitely, it feels like a taboo in a lot of ways, I think still. But I think for me, really, it was understanding and getting more education about kind of that bigger picture of philanthropy, the history of wealth and power in this country. Pretty soon after I found out about that I had inherited this money, I really was I feel like this kind of critical point looking back. And I attended a seminar put on by Susan Raffo, who's a amazing person here who lives in the Twin Cities. And I'm sure many people watching have connections or know about Susan. But in the early 2000s, I went to a workshop that she was putting on at a queer families conference that was about queerness and class. And I truly did not understand the broader framework around class. And I left there understanding that in this country, in the US, that I had more money than 99% of folks, and worldwide, like 99.99%. And that just hit me so hard. Obviously, I knew that I was rich before that, but I did not have that wider context. And so, to be honest, I was kind of distraught after attending that workshop. I feel like I was really at kind of this critical point where it could have kind of gone different ways. And a couple things happened. First of all, I had really good, close friends and people who loved me that I could talk to about it. Even after being told that I shouldn't talk about it from my family, because that's a secret that, rich people don't talk about your money. It's rude and you don't want people to know. But these were like chosen family, and they really listened, and they were compassionate, and they also gently yet firmly gave me a reality check that, being rich was not something to feel despondent about. That I really had a responsibility to think about what this meant for me, for my life. I couldn't, and they really encouraged me. They're like, don't just like put this out of your mind and continue living your life like it doesn't exist, because it does exist for you. And I think a lot of folks who inherit money have that experience, I think, of people have all different responses, but I definitely, since I have been more in organizing with other folks, who in their 20s and 30s, 40s, inherited money, that they're definitely, especially for folks who are progressive minded, they sort of just want to pretend like it's not happening. And so I was encouraged by people who really knew me and cared about me to not do that. And that was good. The other thing was that I was really lucky that I had family that had that expectation and desire for me to give most of my money away. And my dad had met folks who worked for Headwaters. And even though Headwaters, I don't think he might disagree with me now, but I think at the time it wasn't really the type of place that he maybe was a little bit more progressive, or a lot more progressive than a place he would be involved in. Mm-hmm. He really was honest that he saw it as a place that could help me. He's like, I think you should go talk to these people. And what I really found in that over the years was that, I felt very treated in a non-judgmental way. I felt like I was really seen, now looking back, I can see I was really treated like a whole person, not just a check. And that I really received connection to people from all different class backgrounds and people involved in movement work, donors, activists, grantees, you name it, everybody. And I just received education. I had the opportunity for education, and somebody that was willing to listen. And also, as you shared, Maria, share part of their story with me, not just kind of showing up and expecting kind of this one-sided relationship. And yeah, those are the things that I think really set me up to be, those are really the biggest things that set me up to be in the place that I am at today around, and how I feel about my wealth, and feeling very open about it, and active in redistributing it. So
yeah, I mean, I think, Elizabeth, the first time we had met a couple times, but the first time we sat down for like a donor meeting, I remember talking with David, my old boss and predecessor, and saying like, okay, like this is the place, if Headwaters is the place that's going to be really serious about working with donors differently, like I think I'm going to ask some like really pointed questions. So I sat down, I remember thinking like, I don't know if this person's going to respond to me really well, but my first question was, where does your wealth and class privilege come from? It was the first time I had ever asked that question very directly, and was willing to sit in the discomfort of like, this might make this person uncomfortable. It might make them upset with me that I'm being so direct, but really seeing like the risk of not asking that question meant that we weren't going to have a more authentic relationship. And I think it really changed a trajectory for me in the way that I think about fundraising now, as it's a coaching opportunity. So oftentimes the work that I do with you and other folks is I'm really asking hard questions about like, what are your values? How are we staying in alignment with that? Remember, these are the goals that you talked about. What are the other resources that you're seeking to be able to support you in your giving? And I think that coaching element has really been a part of my donor organizing practice that has really shifted from more traditional ways that I used to do it. Really sort of, oftentimes we talk about meeting donors where they're at. And I think that sort of paradigm can be kind of tough for me to swallow anymore, because I think it actually puts us as donor organizers in a position to like not push and not sort of like play that coaching role. So I just would reflect like that was a really big shift for me. And I know both Hali and Nneka, like you are working directly with donors, really doing that organizing and coaching. So what are you learning about donors and your own practice through that?
Well, Nneka, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when you're saying that too, Maria, it's, so I used to work at an arts nonprofit and did like pretty traditional forms of fundraising. And now I'm working with the fields at Root Springs and doing donor organizing way in a much different way. And, when you say that, asking donors how and where they acquired their wealth, that being like a new practice, it reminds me that, in traditional philanthropy, there is this like culture of generosity, right? Like, oh, it's actually these people have all of these resources and all this money, and we're going to this meeting, and out of the kindness of their heart, they're considering giving money to us, and like that is the way in which you approach that meeting, and it doesn't actually address the systemic issues at play here, to actually name the fact that philanthropy in and of itself, this conversation in and of itself, is a problem, right? The fact that I'm coming to you to ask you for money is actually indicative of larger systemic issues that allow you to have that wealth in the first place, that allow you to make more wealth off of that wealth that you can continue to hide and not pay taxes on, and like figure out all of these other loopholes, right? And so I think for me, the shift is in naming the systemic issues that we're trying to dismantle, right? And being able to go into a conversation, and that question being a manifestation of that, but really like being able to have just like a human conversation, right? And just being able to say like, this is who I am, and this is my story, my money story, and inviting someone, right? I really do believe in this work being an invitation. And I think with us at the Fields at Root Springs, I think we're really conscious of not every donor, not every person is in a space where they're ready to have a conversation with us around how to invest in this work. And we're not really going to be, there's a certain level of education in which we're not willing or interested in doing. But we do see this as like an invitation to have a conversation with me about what you're trying to repair in your life. Like, what does reparations, what can it look like for you? And how can you making an investment in this land-based Black liberation reparations project be a part of the ways in which you practice that, and still let us all still be in conversation around repair work? And so I just want to name some of those values, I think, that underlie the work, are like kind of foundational to the work, that make it feel a little bit different.
Thank you for that, Nneka. I wanted to hop in and just riff on something all of you guys said, I think, which is like, what if instead of asking like where the donor is at, and Elizabeth, I went to social work school too, so that's what we learn, right? Like you meet the client where they're at, and then taking the sociopolitical everything. What if we just flipped it? Like, let's just change the subject and let's meet Maria where she's at, or let's meet Anathea where she's at, or let's meet Vanessa or Ijen where they're at, and let's make them the subject and the hero, or their movements or our communities, rather than even a single person, because that's really the truth of it, and I think that the repair in philanthropy can come when we literally switch the subject. It is not about a rich, white, often dead guy who's got, a ton of money, or Mackenzie, as much as I think she's doing amazing work, just like moving tons of money, like what if we just change the subject to the people on the ground doing the work, because that work is harder and they're taking the real risks, So I think there's that, like it's a paradigm shift in a way. And then I also think if we could, the relationship piece is incredibly important, what you brought up, Maria, and also Elizabeth, like deep relationships with people who are different from us, like in a time in our country when there are so many forces that are just splitting us apart, right? Like everyone is going into their bubbles and their silos, and I'm different, you're different, like just like retreating. And there's like a constriction in how we're defining a voter, and there's a constriction in how we're defining a woman or a man or gender. There's a constriction in how we're defining women's access to their reproductive health. There's just all these efforts in our society to restrict and limit. And I think that like Fabiana or a bunch of the people who I have the privilege to work with I think it's incumbent on all of us to be expansive in as many of these roles and definitions as we can. And part of that expansiveness is actually sitting down and being friends and breaking bread with and sharing a bottle of wine with, or taking a walk with, or going for a run, or sharing our dog stories with people who are really different from us. And if we can just practice that with donors and colleagues and across movements, I think we can go a little bit towards the repair of those components of our democracy. It's literally about our democracy and civic engagement, because those forces on the other side are well-funded and well-organized, and dividing us has always been a strategy, and it's a really effective one. So in the ways that we, in small ways and medium ways and larger ways, can fight that, then that's the way forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think so much of what you're talking about actually brings to, for me, kind of a question of like, what does it mean to be in right relationships with the communities that we aim to benefit through our donor organizing, as well as with the donors, right? And there's a conversation that Holly and I have been involved in for about 2 years now, talking about what does it mean in working with donors to center movements and to decenter the donor. And I think like it's such a big topic, right? Because we don't want donors to feel like they're simply an ATM. We don't want donors to feel like they don't matter. We do believe that they matter really greatly, but I think exactly what you were saying earlier, it's about how do we center, just thinking like social media lingo, like who's the main character of this story? And the main character of the story are the movements and communities that are doing the work and changing the world. But how do we have that conversation as we kind of sit in the middle of a lot of that? I mean, it feels like this tension, and it's kind of to me, I like the tension of it, right? But I think like this is something that I imagine many of the fundraisers on this call are thinking about, is like, okay, I hear you, it's about centering the movements and the people, but like I've still got, these donors that I have to figure out how to cultivate and steward for the long term, for my organization, for the work, etc. So it's a bit of a conundrum. I think it's both art and science, most likely, is the answer.
Yeah, I think that's really true, Maria. I love the image of a table. I'm just going to jump right in. And like, if we think about a social change ecosystem, it's a big table. There's advocacy, there's law and lawyers, there's writers, there's artists, there's people on the streets protesting, there's those of us on the inside that are let's get inside strategy and outside strategy. The table is pretty big. And I remember a girlfriend of mine had twins, and we used to go to marches together. And I was like, well, I'm not going to see her for 10 years, like as our lives move and change, our role around that table can move and change. But in an ideal world, we're in relationship with each other. We know, like, I know Nneka's out there doing her thing, and I totally believe and trust in her. I know that Elizabeth's out there doing your thing, and I believe and trust in you. And same with you, Maria. And we're all towards liberation and justice, right? It's a big, big, big goal. But in an ideal world, I wish we could get together sometimes and talk about which pieces we're holding and moving. But that table metaphor is what I really like when I'm speaking or thinking about donor organizing and moving donors and donor education and being in community with donors. And I'm a donor too, right? Like all of us are donors. We might not give away all the zeros that some people do, but all of us is giving a lot of money away. I just know it. And it's a meaningful amount of money for our families. So it's us too, like we sit in that role, but we also sit in other places. And as our lives move and change, we will have the grace to move and change to a different spot around that table. So I'll just share that metaphor with this room.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just gonna say too. So with Root Springs, we host these reparations circles where like every quarter we just hold space for folks to come together, and we facilitate it and bring in art and spirituality and political education. But really the goal is how can we each come to this space to think about what we each individually and collectively need to repair. And one of the things that came up early on was that we use a lot of phrases that it's not really clear what we mean by them. So like doing the work, like, are you doing the work? Like that is like a phrase, like, what does that actually even mean? Like doing the work, but it's a phrase that we kind of all have just agreed to keep saying. In right relationship came up too, like, what do we really mean when we say like we want to be in right relationship to the land, to labor, to each other. And so we've started to just hold space to start to unpack some of these phrases and words. And so at our last one, in right relationship was the phrase that we started to like have conversation around. And folks just started to like, throw in the chat for them what it means. And a lot of the themes that were coming up were around like reciprocity and like mutuality, right? Not thinking about anything being one directional or unilateral, but really thinking about like, I like the table metaphor too, because I'm picturing a circular table, but like
Yes.
thinking about, what does it look like to have some balance as well? And so for me, I think a lot of my self-work is thinking through, how am I also implicated in this? And I think, Hali, I feel like you've mentioned this too, around how like a lot of folks think about like that wealthy white donor, and like sometimes we like, race and class are interconnected, but they're also like separate. And how can we think about these things a little bit with more nuance? And when we think about reparations and repair, I think part of what we're inviting folks in is like, how are you both, and some of this language I've learned too from Headwaters Giving Project, like both benefiting from these systems and being burdened by them. And I think particularly for me as a Black woman with class privilege, that is just like my everyday, right? Like, how am I realizing the ways in which I'm implicated in this work, right? That, yeah, I'm helping a Black liberation, Black reparations land project. And also I've benefited from the systems that have actually stripped wealth away, have stolen land from Native folks, have stripped wealth away from Black folks, right? And so there is a way in which I'm coming to those conversations, inviting other people to name how them and their families have benefited, but also like inviting myself to reflect on the ways, like, this is not a unilateral thing, right? Like, this is both of us doing the work, both of us doing the work to unpack our stuff around how we're all implicated in this work, how we're all like settlers and gentrifiers in one way, right? And so that for me is part of how I've been thinking about right relationship is, like, we're all implicated in this, right? And how do we have like a balanced mutual effort of digging through our stuff together and being connected to it together, and knowing that this is what this relationship is. It's not just us giving money, but us kind of committing to holding each other as we unpack some really difficult things, and committing to stay in relationship when maybe we say some things that are not right, or, and this is why money is so weird to talk about and taboo, because it's like, I feel this thing. Is it okay for me to say it in this space and not feel like I'm going to be rejected or ostracized afterwards, but to really feel like you all are committed to being in relationship with me and helping to move me and educate me, etc.
I love the way that you all are doing that at Root Springs, Nneka, because I just think about like, it's so necessary to do the work. I love that you're defining that stuff, because I love it. I love examples and I hate catchphrases. I'm like, what are we even talking about? But I just think about like, it's so necessary for each of us to do that for multiple reasons. But I just think about in my own situation, like doing that work has allowed me to be really brave and fluid in my giving, for lack of a better way, but like responsive, I guess, would be the better word, because of course there's places that I love and support, and I just, every April I just like ding, 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 right off, 10 checks or whatever. But that's not like how the world works. And I just think about like our how we got to know each other through Root Springs, and you all coming to me, and us meeting and becoming in relationship to one another. And I think I just think about knowing you a little bit better now, and what you've shared about the work that you've done, and thinking about some of the work that I've done. I think that is a really big part of why we were able to come together and so quickly talk about money and our stories and do some of this stuff, because I think if we're not doing the work in community, it can just feel so lonely. And I think it can feel lonely, I've learned, for anybody, no matter what their situation. But I think for wealthier folks, isolation is a big piece of it. Mm-hmm. And just what you shared earlier, Maria, about not centering the donors, which doesn't mean that we don't care about donors. I think a big piece of the problem and that ickiness that I have felt is it's because it's not just that we center donors, we center folks who are giving the most money. And that isn't necessarily, I mean, we need folks who are able to give a lot of money to give a lot of money. But that doesn't mean that somebody who's giving $100 a year, that might be a huge sacrifice for them. And we don't, traditionally in philanthropy, I just know we don't honor people in those same ways. They don't get, the phone calls or the special access or treated differently. And my experience with that, because I am able to give more dollars, is it doesn't feel great. I don't want to I want to be in relationship with folks, but I don't want to feel like I'm getting some type of access or special show because I happen to have money. I'm not saying that's true for everybody who is a wealthy person, but I do find more and more when I'm in relationship with people, folks don't want that. That doesn't, they know it, they know that it's not authentic and it doesn't feel great. So I often, when I talk to fundraising folks, I'm like, and I bring that up. I'm like, if you feel like that's something you've had to do, I fully give you permission to stop doing that. Just stop doing it.
I release you.
I release
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you're bringing up such a good point, which, one thing I think about our experience at Headwaters about organizing donors across class is one of the through lines is shame. It's actually one of the biggest things, right? So as poor people, we're taught to camouflage ourselves and to not talk about it, right? We're supposed to do all these things, social cues, the way we dress, the way we talk, the education we get, all of that. And I think the same thing that you're identifying as a wealthy person, we don't talk about that. All of a sudden I was going to break into, we don't talk about Bruno. We have kids at home.
There's still time, Maria. There's still
I know. If my kids were here, they'd be singing it. But I think this idea of secrecy and how we do that. And I think what Headwaters offers our donor community is an opportunity to do this work in a truly diverse way, where people are really able to see each other, hear each other's stories, and get inspired and excited about what they're giving means to them. We use the language of a personally meaningful gift, and that is very, very intentional, right? I remember our very first giving project back in 2015 that we hosted. Our smallest gift was a $25 gift. And this was a trans young person who was working in a coffee shop, was really struggling to make ends meet. And that idea of a personally meaningful gift really released them from the shame of I'm not able to make a $10,000 gift, or I think we had a $25,000 gift come through that first giving project, and that those people could be in the same giving project and make collective decisions about where their dollars went. And those participants really knew deep down in their guts that my vote doesn't matter less because I gave less money, right? And I think that's a way in which we can start to really situate ourselves as donor organizers and help bring people together, because part of what makes giving so impactful is when it's done as a community. And I think that's such a big thing that drives many of us is how do we do this in community, especially when we think about organizing and movement building work? That is all about relationship and community and building bridges, right, of understanding. So I just think about how we, bring in donors at different levels and really help them to really appreciate that what they're doing is really important regardless of the dollar amount that they're giving.
It's a beautiful model, Maria, the giving projects. I just think it's so beautiful. And I think all boards, foundation boards, should be in giving projects if possible, all the gatekeepers. I read something really beautiful recently about how in some spaces, especially when you're doing something new or something a little bit scary, it's good to be with people who are just like you, who you can kind of, if you're a little scared, right? But then in other moments in your same life or in your same day or in the same week, it's really important to be with people who are really not like you and working just as hard to make those relationships and commitments to each other work. And I thought that was really profound, because it's sort of simple, But again, it's like, like the time that we're living in is it just really calls for it, like we just have to be in some spaces that are just like my people. And when we were building the Donors of Color Network, we talked about this too, right? But then there's other places where we really got to stand up with and by and for and behind and in front of with our brothers and sisters and around the movement and around the world, right? Like we've got to be in those expansive places too.
I think that your point about, doing that work with people, I know, Nneka, you mentioned resource generation. They're a partner of ours. We have a really vibrant cohort here in the Twin Cities, and there's many chapters around the country that are really working on organizing, in particular, young donors with wealth and class privilege. Elizabeth, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about sort of like what that experience was for you. And I know recently you've done some work for folks who kind of have aged out of the resource generation world, but you're still building community with people within your age group to really think about that next phase of your donor life.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. So just to preface that, one thing that I feel like up until like 3 years ago, I was really still struggling with was I was giving significantly. I knew that I wanted to really increase my giving and have a plan for how to distribute most of my wealth. And I also was mulling around, how do I do this in the context of my life? So I have a 15-year-old daughter that, as Maria said, I homeschooled. I've been homeschooling her since 4th grade because she is very bright and she's also severely dyslexic. And I have a disability myself with chronic pain that really affects me day to day. And so part of, I feel like that was sort of a barrier for me, or something I was struggling with, was how do I make, a plan and really figure out how to do this work in the context of my life. Because it's scary, right? It was also really scary to be like, there's no school for my kid, and I can solve this problem because I can afford to leave my job and stay home with her. How the hell do people do this if they don't have millions of dollars? So these were things that were coming up for me. And one thing, well, I will say 2 things have been really instrumental, is that I started working with a financial advisor who is Roya, who's sponsoring this and hopefully watching. And I can't recommend that enough. If you are a person who works with wealthy folks, to really, as much as you can, help them connect, if they have the desire, with a financial planner or wealth manager who not just who has that title, but who really understands that not everybody wants to hoard their money, because that profession, everything is set up in our society to help folks do that. And it's absolutely possible to use those same capitalist systems to do the opposite. And thankfully people know how to do that, because I couldn't figure it out. For a couple of years, I just thought I should be able to figure this out. I couldn't figure it out. Don't try to figure it out. Just go to people who know how to do it, and that's their job. So that made a huge difference. And then really in a relational way, one of the hugest things was that Resource Generation ran a group, and I had been part of other RG programming prior to this, and they ran a group for folks who'd been alumni or had otherwise aged out of RG, who also were what they call high net worth individuals. So I can't remember how they define that, but I think it would be probably someone who has at least $5 million or more. So kind of like ultra wealthy folks. And they had a group that ran for 6 months that was run through RG and had both sharing time and political education. And it was just so well done. And our group really connected. We've all continued to meet throughout the past year and a half. And a significant thing about that for me is that those folks, we all, I think except for one person, we all have children that we're still actively parenting. And so feeling doing this work day to day when you're having children and doing that. It's time, we're tired. I'm less tired because I have one and she's 15, but I'm homeschooling her. So to have just people that are like, we're showing up for you, it's an incentive to show up for each other and hold each other accountable. And it also, I feel like, to be honest, we were able to address some things that I hadn't felt I really could find community around, which is, how do you do this and create a financial plan and do that in a way, knowing that many folks never have that opportunity. But the reality is I felt like I had to do that first and think about taking care of myself and my disability. And, there's so much pressure to, when you're wealthy, to like set aside trust funds for your kids. These are things that I didn't even want to deal with. It felt so gross to me, but I had to really take an honest look at like, what decisions do I want to make for my daughter? Do I want to pay for college? Do I want her to have to take out loans? Do I want to leave her any money? Thankfully, I had a lot of support, and we've always talked really openly with her about money. But having other folks that I have been able to do that work from, it's just been incredible. And we've tracked, I can't give you like statistics, even though I love statistics. I was trained as an evaluator, but I mean, it would be like, we tracked how much money we were all giving at the beginning of that, and then how much we're giving now. And it is like millions and millions and millions of more dollars. So I just think about, it's so important to be in community in various ways. And for me to be able to sit down on Zoom once a month with those folks, knowing that I can just let my guard down, I can say anything and they're not going to judge me. If it's like, oh, I said I was going to do that, I still haven't done it, or we can celebrate and kind of push each other to be like, hey, you've been thinking about that. This is like the third meeting, 3 months that you've been talking about that. Like, what is keeping you from just writing that like $500,000 check? Do you want to just write it right now? And like, we've been able to do it. So It's just, I can't say enough about doing this work in community. It's really important.
Nneka, I'm really curious about, you talked earlier about sort of, some realizations you had a few years ago and stuff. And as you're both a donor and a donor organizer, most likely, right, folks that I tend to find, for example, for me, I don't get asked for money very often, right? As like a person of color, that's just not my reality. Yeah. And so as you kind of straddle these worlds, like, how are you seeing this idea of like community as you're sort of grappling with your class privilege, just the realities of raising money around issues that you care about, in particular around Black liberation? I imagine that community aspect just continues to be really important to you as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like that came up as both you and Elizabeth were talking, and I was kind of reflecting on some of the work in Headwaters, both as a participant and as like a co-facilitator last year. And I mean, I think the meaningful gift is so powerful in so many ways. And I think one of the things that I think is most powerful and transformative about it is that it's actually like a personal decision. And I think what keeps it in check, I guess, is the fact that we actually are a community and we're going to be transparent about our race and class privileges. We're going to be transparent about how much we're giving, and we're going to go through this process together. But at the end of the day, like, you are going to decide for yourself, like, how much you're going to give. And I remember a couple of times folks being like, well, can you just like tell me like how much and it's like, no, I'm not gonna tell you. Like, you actually have to go through that process. But we here as a community, and kind of going to like Elizabeth, what you were just saying, are going to be here to hold you accountable and like to ask you prompting questions to get you to that place. And so I think just more and more, I think community is always the answer, right, for everything. And I think for me in my journey and kind of where I'm at right now has been trying to find and build more community with Black folks with class privilege. And I think I'm in this part of my journey. And I think I've thought about this for a few years now too, of I think there's specific conversations that you can have in community, right? And in some spaces that are for folks with class privilege who are thinking about resource mobilization and redistributing wealth. And, sometimes it can become a conversation about whiteness and white supremacy. And that's not exactly what I'm looking for. And so trying to think about how can I do a little bit more deeper work in community. It reminds me a little bit of what Hali was saying around, there's certain conversations that I think will be easier for me to have in that space, and certain conversations I think will be harder for me to have in that space. Either way, I'm like ready to have those conversations and to be prompted in those ways. And I think too, with Root Springs, like a lot of our organizing has been with white folks. And I think that there's a way in which I'm really obviously grateful for the relationships that we've made and the amount that we've raised. And I think every now and then I'm still like asking myself those questions around, what would it look like for us to fund our own work? And when I say us, I mean like Black folks, right? And what is preventing more Black folks who, in Minneapolis there, I was a part of, having worked in this corporate community and other communities, like I saw and was a part of these communities. How do I invite more of those folks into these spaces to be having conversation around Black liberation and having conversations around what does it look like to have more cross-class relationships within the Black community? Something that I think I've asked myself around, what do my cross-class relationships look like? And so I think I'm very much in a questions phase of my life and thinking a little bit more about, how do we continue to just build community around the questions that we're asking ourselves so that we're not doing it in isolation, to Elizabeth's point, that isolation that could breed shame and all of these other things that are not productive. But how can we start to build those communities if we don't find them naturally?
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to move us to our question and answer portion. And just thanks for everybody who contributed your questions. It's so interesting to see like what's on the minds of our audience today. And a big part of it, I'll just put it under the umbrella of white supremacy culture. So, right, questions about how white fragility might show up in our work as donor organizers and as donors as well, which I think includes things like scarcity mindset, competition, metrics around effectiveness and impact. I mean, these are all things that I know all of us have talked about in our prep call and have thought about in our work day to day. And so, I think just a question is like, we're talking about a really different way of being in relationship in community and with donors. And so what are some of the ways that you are both recognizing that white supremacy exists in this work, but also working to undo the ways in which white supremacy shows up for us on a daily basis? That's a big
That's my reaction too.
That's a hard one, Maria. I mean, gosh, you were there. We got yelled at by a giant in our sector at that time, and it was crazy, and all the thing that was making that person so angry was just a statement of values. Maria and I were in this room, and we were two out of maybe 3 or 4 women of color in a pretty white room, and we were just saying like values are everything in philanthropy, especially, right? And it was so enraging to some of the folks in the room who come from a really different strategic kind of practice. But, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm old, Maria, like I'm getting older, like I just don't have tons of patience for that. Like I know there's a ton of money to be moved and a lot of important work to be funded. And I just want to do that, And so I'm not like super, super, super interested in persuading that dude and people like him anymore, because there's a lot of really good work that can happen just here instead of like that, But maybe you're just catching me in a cranky moment. That's very, very possible. I'm building this freedom school for philanthropy, and we're piloting it at Fidelity in a couple of weeks. And it's kind of simple. Like Fidelity is the biggest DAF holder in the world. They have more DAF holders on reserve than any other place in the world. Luckily, because of access, I know some people who work there. Like Elizabeth, what you were saying before, like if we have access to these places, like it's sort of foolish not to use our access. It's a form of power.
Yes.
And we have to talk about power if we're talking about, that's a whole other tributary talk perhaps around power. But one of the things that we're building in our curriculum, and I have to say that the DNA of the curriculum is movement people. Like we interview 20 movement leaders, some of whom are famous, some of whom are not famous, and ask them, like, if you could create a perfect donor, or tell us about some relationships that you've got with donors who have been in authentic, true partnership with you. What are the attributes of that person? And we are building this curriculum around their guidance and wishes. It's so simple, right? Like go ask the people who know the most about organizing, and also about the relationships with individual donors that have been really good and also really not good. And let's build to this model, right? So that's part one. And then there's all this money sitting here and all these DAFs that's not sitting there, that's just sitting there, not doing anything. So let's go there and try to move that money out the door, more of it out the door faster, for all the things that need to get funded, like by, a lot of, I kind of think like, let's not make it too complicated. Like the root word for philanthropy is not impact or strategy or strategic plan or logic model. The root word for philanthropy is love, and it's love for our brothers and our sisters and our queer aunties and cousins and siblings and children, right? Like that's the root word. And there's a lot of stuff out here, but in some ways I think what we're talking about is like, let's bring it down and real. That was my rant for the afternoon.
I love that. I love how you know. I mean, I'm like, if that's cranky, more of that. I love just the question that you asked folks too. And yeah, I mean, I love this conversation for so many reasons, but I think I shared, that most of my professional work has been in like program evaluation. So I get it. I mean, I could just live inside logic models. Like they feel so good. But but the other piece of that is that I just so resonate with what you're talking about, because it doesn't like mean anything. Mm-hmm. It's not, at the end of the day, it's like what has happened, what is the action? I mean, that's what impact is supposed to be about. And you don't need nobody needs like grants, right? Like a 10-page report about that. Okay. We don't need it. There's so many better ways to you can still get the information without all that gobbledygook. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so hard too, because I feel like anytime I think about just transition work, I think the thing that like gives me solace, I guess, is the fact that we have to carry this burden of contradiction, right? Where we're trying to like leave this old system and build and create and move into this new system, and being in between, we are kind of at times carrying this contradiction. And I feel like I am definitely someone who can easily fall back into that like traditional thing, right? Whether it's because some of the foundations who've given to us, who still are like progressive and radical, but still have reports, or still want to know like how many people were served, and still, really uplift the written word, and like all of these things that, are core tenets of white supremacy culture. I feel like I can slip back into that, right? And it's hard to continue to push forward and try to build this new world and space when you're still kind of beholden a little bit to folks who are still operating in these other spaces, right? Like we're not always all moving together. And so I think it can be challenging. And I feel like we try to find ways to constantly name those challenges, even when we're like, still kind of, honoring or abiding by whatever rules or whatever. At least being able to name those things and not let them just go unnoticed. But I think it's hard, I think it's hard, right?
It is hard, yeah.
To fully be like absolve ourselves of operating with a white supremacy culture.
Yeah, I mean, we have so many fundraisers on this call today, and several questions that we've received have been like, how do I get started? And I think one is institutionally, you've got to have the backing of your organization to start to have these conversations in a really true and authentic way. And I think certainly, I took a risk with Elizabeth saying, like, tell me how you came to be rich. Like, I want to know that story, to maybe making some invitations to different speakers. There's so many great organizations that are having these conversations where you can really utilize sort of those third party validators and messengers to help you kind of build that connection with your donors. And I think we recently, our community just lost a great donor and donor organizer named Ann Manning. And I just remember one of my first meetings with her, she took me to a fundraising event and introduced me to a bunch of people. And it was such a great opportunity to just spend time together in the community around an issue we both really cared about. And I think those are the ways that we can start to sort of get our foot in the door to having those conversations, as those shared experiences. And I think not everybody's going to be able to do a giving project. Not everybody is going to be able to do a giving circle in the way that Hali does it. But I think so important for us to think about what are those just like small ways, right, of just like igniting a conversation that then helps us to be able to find, all right, what are those points of alignment? Where are those points of connections? Okay, we just listened to this amazing speaker. What's coming to mind for you? Like, where did you feel uncomfortable? Here's where I felt some discomfort, right? And I think those are the ways, right, of like building that relationship that allows you to start to undo and dismantle white supremacy culture when it comes to philanthropy and giving.
That's such a good point, Maria. And there is a resource that I can share. So, the portrait report, which is, I got to do this. I was so lucky, and it was so fun to get to interview wealthy donors of color across the country. And I've interviewed 150 individuals with wealth who are BIPOC folks across the country. So our interview instrument is, you can have it for free, and it's an appendix on the back of our report, the full report. So if you go to radiantstrategies.co/reports, Maria and team can send it to anyone who's interested in the exec summary and the full report, but it's in the appendix. So and I've been a development director, I've been an ED, many of us have done fundraising. And I hear you, and Maria's totally right. Like, it's really not fair if you don't have the support of your boss and the C-suite, in a way, of your organization to be in charge of doing whatever you're being tasked to do, which I bet is impossible. But you take a look at this interview instrument, and not everyone has 90 minutes to spend with donors, but maybe you've got 45 minutes to spend with a section of your donors. And I would encourage you not to do that only with your wealthiest donors, but also with the volunteers that show up week after week, who might not be the wealthiest, but think about the time, talent, treasure, testimony, and ties, all the ways that we support and give and influence. Think about those key people at different segments of the dollar amounts, and see if you can tweak this interview instrument so that you can start building those relationships over time, because that's the work.
Absolutely. Well, we are nearing the end of our time, and I just want to say thank you again to Elizabeth and Nneka and Hali for joining me today. I know that we could probably talk on this topic for hours, and so maybe in the future we can have a follow-up event. We certainly talk about organizing donors here all the time. So, to our guests, please feel free to reach out to us and ask us questions. We know that we didn't get to all of the questions in the Q&A portion. So our plan is to follow up with folks, and feel free to reach out to the Headwaters staff. We're really excited that so many people wanted to have this conversation with us today. Again, I want to thank our sponsors, Claim Our Space, Moon Palace Books, Propel for Nonprofits, and Roya LLC. And of course, to our one of our production companies that we work with, Line Break Media. We've been with them. We were actually their first signed paid contract many, many years ago, about a decade ago. So we're excited to continue to work with them. just a few things that I'm walking away from this conversation with is, just an emphasis on relationship, an emphasis on authenticity. We cannot do this work. We being communities, movements, donor organizers, we can't do this alone and in isolation. And it really matters that we hold these relationships really sacred, and that we're also, I heard a lot of conversation today about not only encouraging and educating and coaching, but also around accountability, right? This is our accountability. Giving is a really important act towards building power and building the kind of change that we want to see in the future. And so as we're thinking about this, that component is really critical. As you're all walking away from our time today, I hope that you think about the role that you can be playing. What are the small steps that you can be taking? It might seem really tiny to you, but actually in working with donors and working with your community, and or even thinking about your own philanthropy and giving, those tiny shifts really make a big difference over time. And I see the work that donors are doing as lifetime work. There are very few donors that I work with that just sort of like give 1 year and then stop giving the next. It really is, I see an evolution in the ways that people are working with community and thinking about their resources. I'll finally just say, one of the pieces that I think a lot about in this work and was brought back up into my memory as we were talking today, there's an amazing Black donor organizer nationally named Tynesha McHarris. And she actually implores donors. Her work is really around organizing donors to fund Black communities, to fund Black movement building. And what she says is, fund us like you want us to win. At the end of the day, right? These are organizations and these activists are on the ground doing the work that we really need. And we need to fund them like we want them to win, like we believe in our collective liberation, like we believe in Black people, like we believe in Native people, etc. It is so important that we are thinking about our dollars in that way. So just again, heartfelt thanks to my friends, Elizabeth, Hali, and Nneka. I just really appreciate you telling your stories and sharing your inspiration with the Headwaters community. And special thanks to you, our audience, for spending time with us today. I know we got you during your lunch hour, most likely. And for those who are observing Ramadan right now, Ramadan Mubarak, it's just so important to recognize you all. Thanks for being in community with us. We couldn't host events like this and have conversations like this without you today. We also intend to offer another Tributary Talk in the fall. These first two events have gone really well. We're so excited at the reception that we have received from our community. And so we're going to take a few months off this summer, but you can definitely plan on seeing us back here in the virtual space again. And at some point in the future, we look forward to seeing you in person as well. So again, just deepest gratitude. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.